Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Asia podcast. I'm Doug Krisner. You can join Brian Curtis and myself for the stories making news and moving markets in the APAC region. You can subscribe to the show anywhere you get your podcast and always on Bloomberg Radio, the Bloomberg Terminal, and the Bloomberg Business app.
We are joined in our studios by Stefanie Holtze-Jen, Asia-Pacific CIO of Deutsche Bank, a private bank, for a closer look at markets. So we mentioned at the top there, Stefanie, that Nvidia became the world's most valuable company, jumping ahead of Apple and Microsoft. So a lot of people own Nvidia. We've seen it run up 43% in the past month alone. That's more than the 5% we've seen from Microsoft. It begs the question, what's a good way to basically hedge concentration risk?
Good morning, Brian. I would have been surprised not to get a question on Nvidia, to be honest. So it is mind-boggling, because if everybody would own the stock, then it wouldn't have the capacity to make new highs every day we speak. So I think it's important to diversify, absolutely, because concentration risk is a huge issue. I think you have a lot of ability to also diversify looking into Asian proxies. So as we've already seen, the markets like Taiwan that are also being driven by one of the largest semiconductor company, but also markets that are also participating in the technology run, like Malaysia, Singapore a little bit, China, Hong Kong. So all the tech-heavy indices, they are all benefiting. So it's worthwhile to look into this part of the world to also participate, I would think.
Yeah, no doubt about that. I mean, right now I'm looking at TSMC in Taiwan up about 2% in the early going here. But let's talk a little bit more broadly about artificial intelligence, the impact that it may have. I'm curious about the conversations over at Deutsche Bank, the private bank, and what clients are asking you about this AI, the thesis here, and the fact that, once it becomes kind of fully adopted, that it's going to be so transformational that everything that we're seeing now in terms of price action will be justified. Is that the way you see it, or is there a little bit too much enthusiasm, maybe a little excessive enthusiasm?
Well, the conversations are definitely double-sided. So first of all, they are not only happening today. We have this as a long-term investment theme. It's a second-generation technology that is coming our way, and artificial intelligence and then the semiconductor need on the back of this is part of that story. So, but of course, now that we are coming into new highs, we have more of the conversation, as you said, as it's becoming concentrated in clients' portfolios. It's of course, of great urgency to have these dialogues. But I think there's at this point in time, an understanding that this is a transformational change, and there's many different parts that may even not be appreciated as to where it could apply. So right now, this is still fueling the story, and it's also something that has been driving us to upgrade our equity forecasts across the board in the US, but also in Asia.
Yeah, when you talk about diversification, it's tricky because the tentacles of AI stretching everywhere. We've seen already, even utilities rally. We've seen, HVAC companies rallies. We've seen so many different types of companies rally that it's almost like, well, it's not if Nvidia fails, but what if AI fails? What if that theme doesn't play out? So that's a big concern. So are there some other themes that you really like that are very much counter to that?
There's, as you rightly point out, there's lots of themes there, but some of them are relating to a technology advance as well. So I think you look at a long-term theme that we also like is the population support, which comes in around the health tech. We have an aging population, for instance, but of course there's a tech element to also advancing in that spectrum. But there's, an infrastructure build that is necessary around, a lot of these other themes. There's also infrastructure that needs to build out in their old way of economy. But, EV these are themes that are still prevailing alongside ESG. So resource transition, population support, and the next generation technology. These are the big three groups that we're looking at.
You have a very unique perspective. You started your career in Germany. Obviously, you went through Hong Kong. Well, maybe that's not obvious. You did go through Hong Kong. You're in Singapore now. That is obvious. Talk to me about the way that you're viewing the trade tension right now between China and the European Union, and how do you expect this to play out?
It's a sad thing when I listened to your program just now that China is being put in the same box as Iran, Russia, North Korea. So it's definitely a show of hand that this is a Cold War rhetoric. And what we have not mentioned in terms of my past is that I grew up in a Cold War environment in the eastern part of Germany. So it's a very tricky situation when you look at it from a verbal perspective. But I can see that Europe understands that there's a lot of intertwined relationships between China that are going even beyond the trade. So I think Europe is also employing this rhetoric, sadly, but there is a pragmatic way of looking at a trade relationship that is, that will prevail. So right now I think Europe is really targeting the things that relate back to the security element, and I think that makes sense.
Doug will just tick that box about excellent guests. She listens to Bloomberg Daybreak Asia even before she comes on. So, Stefanie, another big question is the Fed too patient? Is the BOJ too patient? I mean, it's the nature of central banks. I sometimes think they're scared of their own shadow in some ways. Should the Fed be cutting here or no?
Well, we think the Fed will be cutting this year. We've been holding on to this view when the market was swinging wildly back from 7 cuts to hiking rates. So we still see 3 cuts in our forecasting period, which is a 1-year ahead. And we see 1 live meeting at a minimum for this next half year. Of course, the Fed is in a situation where we have an election coming up. And right now, we really have a bit of a data challenge going on. Yes, inflation is coming down, but the employment side of things, the household service survey vis-a-vis the non-farm payrolls is showing a bit of a discrepancy. So we need to get to the bottom of this before understanding whether I can make a judgment on whether the Fed is too cautious or not here.
Well, let's ask the same question to the Bank of Japan, because we had minutes from the last meeting a short while ago, and a couple of members are sounding rather hawkish here. Is the BOJ at risk of being behind the curve?
So on the BOJ, I would say they are cautious, and it's not coming as a surprise to the market. It's something that we have to expect if you are a central bank that has been managing through a lost decade, a decade of deflation. Then, of course, you want to be on the absolute 150% sure side to be right in what you're doing. And again, the Bank of Japan right now looks at a data set that is inconclusive. So right now, if I look at activity data, the leading indicators are looking up nicely, but the rest is not really adding up to that same tune to be too aggressive here.
All right. Stefanie, thanks so much. Stefanie Holtze-Jen, APAC CIO at Deutsche Bank, Private Bank. We take a closer look now at the semiconductor industry. A couple of important and interesting developments here. A senior U.S. official is sent to visit Japan and the Netherlands to try to get those countries to put new restrictions on China. The leaders will be asked to put severe limits on ASML and Tokyo Electron. In the meantime, U.S. lawmakers have submitted a bill today that states that companies such as Intel and TSMC would be barred from buying chip-making gear from entities owned or controlled by a host of countries, including China, also including Russia, North Korea, and Iran. Joining us now in our studios is Vlad Savov, a Bloomberg tech editor, for more insights on this. Is this sort of par for the course here, Vlad, or is the U.S. really stepping up the pressure?
I would say it's very much in line with the ongoing trend. I wouldn't say so much stepping up the pressure. The perception from the U.S. and in Washington is more tightening the control and making sure that they plug in any holes. Because when you think about the most important chips today, it's the most valuable company in the world. It's Nvidia. Those AI chips, there have been reports of Chinese companies being able to bring those into China via intermediary countries and companies who are doing the purchases. So in Washington, they're seeing it as plugging up the holes. And one of those is the fact that it's not just the supply of machinery and equipment when we're talking about putting pressure on Japan and the Netherlands to impose the same level of restrictions that the US has imposed on its own companies. It's also the maintenance. So this is the key thing here. The Netherlands, we're talking about ASML, the indispensable supplier of advanced chip-making machinery. And then in Japan, it's Tokyo Electron. Those are two key companies. And what Washington wants to do is make sure that they pull back even further from China, that they don't even maintain equipment that they've put into the country, which is a very high bar. And there's understandable resistance from Japan and the Netherlands.
Is there a way to kind of get around what the U.S. is asking? And I'm wondering if China's been able to do that with some of the other export controls that have been placed. Are they effective? And maybe to the point about, kind of cracks being exposed, whether it's ever going to happen that these cracks can be completely sealed off?
I'm not sure that anybody, even in the US, necessarily wants that to be 100%, because I've said this in talking with Brian previously. If you cut off all the legal or grey market means for China to obtain chips and machinery, they will do it in entirely illegal ways. This is not an optional piece of equipment that we're talking about. Again, I have to return to the fact, I was just looking at it this morning. We're talking about Microsoft, Apple, and Nvidia are the three most valuable companies in the world. They're either chip makers or chip users. And that goes for the top 10 most valuable companies. If China wants to have a thriving and vibrant economy, which has been the theme, if I recall correctly, the two sessions in China this year was all about high quality growth and about how science and technology are going to be essential to that. It needs all of this machinery. So ultimately, US policy is to try and tighten controls as much as possible. But if there's just enough to allow Chinese companies to do that development, they might be okay with that.
You wonder whether or not there's a little overreach here, though, from the United States. I mean, countries like Japan and Holland have extensive business with China on their own. And I wonder whether or not we're hearing through back channels, maybe even, about countries being frustrated by this pressure coming. I mean, they could easily say, look, we have to make policy that is for the best of our citizens, not yours.
That's right, Brian. And you just mentioned Japanese exports going to and increasing to China. That business is absolutely important to Japanese companies. They've made the case. The reporting that we have on this particular topic is that both the Japanese and the Dutch governments are probably trying to wait it out until the November elections so they know exactly the U.S. administration that they'll be dealing with over the long term.
I guess when we were talking about semiconductor production, you got to talk about Taiwan. I mean, where are we right now in trying to diversify away from what is a heavily concentrated center of chip manufacturing?
The answer is we're nowhere near it. I keep returning to these companies, Nvidia and Apple, the two most valuable companies. Without Taiwan and TSMC, and specifically TSMC's production within Taiwan, they don't exist. You cannot speak about iPhones without the chips made in Taiwan. You cannot speak about NVIDIA's AI chips. All of those are made in Taiwan. Now, everyone is putting in the effort to try and diversify, like you say. NVIDIA is really hoping that Samsung and Intel are going to be able to pick up some of that chip making over the long term. Apple would love to, but it cannot have anybody other than TSMC, at least for the current moment. And TSMC is building those fabs in the US, despite the fact that there have been some delays and some issues in doing things in the US that are much easier to do in Taiwan. So things are underway. There are processes underway, but it's going to take a long time.
Vlad, so we have NVIDIA, now the biggest company in the world, planet Earth. Next up, I guess, the universe, right? But I'm curious, because we've talked a lot about the politics. I want to talk more about the business side. So that was a clumsy segue to it. Is the runway still, wide open here for NVIDIA, or is it getting close to, and I'm not talking about the stock price, the business? Is there still plenty of business to be done?
Absolutely. This was a theme of the Computex trade show earlier this month, Brian. I spoke with a bunch of analysts and a bunch of people very much invested, literally and generally invested in the industry. And the way that they see things is that over the next 18 months, NVIDIA is largely without competitor. The likes of Intel and AMD are going to make the case that their chips are maybe more affordable, easier to implement. They have more open rather than proprietary infrastructure. But Nvidia's secret sauce is in that proprietary technology. It's not just we have the fastest chip. We have the fastest interconnects that make 1,000 chips act like one. And all of that stuff is, I analogize it to Nvidia being the Apple of the data center. What that means is you're not going to buy stuff from anybody else. You're going to get everything from us, but it's going to be so good that you're not going to regret it.
That's why the market cap is 3.3 trillion, I guess. Vlad, thank you so much. Always a pleasure. That is Vlad Savov, Bloomberg tech editor in Hong Kong, joining us here on Daybreak Asia.
Russian President Vladimir Putin has arrived in North Korea for his first visit there in some 24 years. We're joined by John Herskovitz, Bloomberg East Asia government editor, for a little bit more insight into this trip. So I saw from your story that when Kim Jong-un was in Russia last September, that satellite imagery showed a big increase in the transfer of arms. Is that what this trip is all about, to the extent we know, John, that Putin is looking for more arms from North Korea?
I think we're seeing first Putin may be showing his gratitude to North Korea for the munitions that it supplied to Russia for its assault on Ukraine. And Bloomberg spoke with South Korea's defense minister last week, who sees Putin as wanting even more. He's probably going to ask Kim Jong-un for more artillery shells, more ballistic missiles, more material to fight the war in Ukraine. Now, the thing is, North Korea has huge stores of weapons that are interoperable with Soviet-era systems that have been dragged out to the front lines of Ukraine. It's one of the places that has the most of the stuff that Putin needs to fight a grinding war and to continue his bombardment of his neighbor.
Is there a bit of a quid pro quo here? Is Kim Jong-un looking for something more than just compensation for the armaments?
He's looking for anything he can get. North Korea is one of the world's poorest states. It's South Korea estimated its economy at $24.5 billion a couple of years ago. So if North Korea gets about $1 billion in aid, that's about 4% of its economy. Anything it can get, from food to building materials to technology to help with weapons to fighter jets, are things it needs. It's a country that really doesn't have a lot. What Russia has sent over has likely been things of this sort. And this could be one of the biggest jolts to North Korea's economy since Kim Jong-un took power about a dozen years ago.
So we saw the comments from Antony Blinken. He said that this is a sort of act of desperation by Russia. If we're neutral observers and we look at this, is this a sign of weakness by Putin being there and looking for more? Or is it a sign of strength, strengthening his alliance?
I think it's just a matter of convenience. North Korea has a lot of what Russia needs. I mean, it's not providing high technology. It's providing, one of the biggest things it's providing are artillery shells, 152 millimeter artillery shells. These are, this is technology from from more than a century ago. North Korea has a lot of stuff that Russia can't find anywhere else. And the thing is, it's convenient. The two share a border and a train link where they can do trade. The Far East Russian ports are near North Korean ports. The satellite imagery that we've seen, others have seen, that the U.S. has shown to the world, show Russian cargo ships at North Korean ports. They shuttle back and forth. They can stay within territorial waters of the two countries to avoid interdiction. So they have a lot. They're nearby. Kim and Putin are both isolated, and in their isolation, they found that they have a lot that they can share.
So that gives kind of a nice segue into the question about Beijing's view on this. I mean, let's bring China into the story. How do you think President Xi is viewing this visit?
Yeah, I think for the first time in a while, China's a little bit on the outside looking in. China, with the fall of the Soviet Union and Russia establishing diplomatic ties with South Korea, Russia's influence over North Korea has waned. In that time, China became an economic power, and it became North Korea's biggest benefactor. Now, the cooperation between Russia and between Russia and North Korea is providing a lot of help for Kim Jong-un, and it's helping Putin. So China's probably trying to evaluate where things stand now. So there may be a little bit of realignment coming in the short term, but the worry is a bit more in the long term. The relationship, this triangular relationship between China, Russia, and North Korea may be adjusted, but it still stands firm against a U.S.-led system. So we'll have a strengthening of the Russia-North Korea side, and this eventually will be to the detriment of the U.S. And China, Russia, and North Korea will work their way out, but they're all of the same mind. They are looking at ways to antagonize the U.S. and its systems.
But Russia is clearly a pariah in the West now. China, maybe not yet, but sort of getting there. So it's still a little bit sensitive to what's said about China in the West.
Exactly. And the thing is, China may look at the cooperation and keep its distance between the two, because there's no benefit for Beijing to step in and try to slow down the trade between Russia and North Korea, especially with the armaments.
John, great stuff. Thanks so much for joining us. John Herskovitz, Bloomberg East Asia government editor, on Putin's trip to North Korea.
This has been the Bloomberg Daybreak Asia podcast, bringing you the stories making news and moving markets in the Asia Pacific. Visit the Bloomberg Podcast channel on YouTube to get more episodes of this and other shows from Bloomberg. Subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen, and always on Bloomberg Radio, the Bloomberg Terminal, and the Bloomberg Business app.